fix that thing. Wouldn't count on him being friendly.
You've got to be kidding me. Well, at least I managed to save myself. Sadly, this is far from the only bug I encountered. Couldn't resist the cheesy pun. But we'll have so many opportunities to discuss technical issues of this game, so let's not sour our introduction. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order is a 2019 action-adventure developed by Respawn Entertainment and published by EA. I don't like drawn comparisons between games of different franchises, preferring to just discuss every title on their own merit regardless of inspiration, and if there are comparisons, to draw them only with direct game relatives, so to speak. But it's quite difficult to do so with Fallen Order, which literally feels like a mix of a number of popular franchises like Dark Souls, Uncharted, Prince of Persia and Metroid. I suppose it makes sense, as Jedi Fallen Order had quite big shoes to fill. This game is the first pure single-player, non-LEGO, console PC Star Wars action-adventure game since 2010's Force Unleashed 2, so fans were quite hungry for some Jedi Star Wars action. And considering all the cancelled video games ranging from Star Wars 1313 to Project Ragtag, it would only make sense to draw inspiration from games that already work very well with existing contemporary audiences. The question is, of course, how it all works, which is what we'll dissect in this video. Versions on all platforms are the same, but the footage you see is taken from the 2021 updated release for PS5. My name is Stanislav Costiuc, I am a game designer, and this is my review of Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, which as always will be done with the help of my Stasocritic scoring system, starting with design. A game's experience is defined by its structure and mechanics. As such, this is the most important category of Stasocritic with the biggest weight, 4. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order doesn't really know what a game it wants to be. It's a mishmash of mechanics, with some done well and some implemented weirdly that don't quite gel together. This can be seen even if we take a look at the core gameplay pillars: combat, navigation and exploration. You can notice that combat stays separate from the rest. Outside of a couple exceptions, the game usually delegates all fighting to specific gameplay arenas that require little environment interaction. Of course, there is another important pillar, which is the Force, that acts as a sort of connective tissue between everything else. One other relatively prominent aspect of Fallen Order is puzzles, but since they're in focus only in a few specific locations, it is questionable whether they should be considered a pillar or not. All this is wrapped in the aspect of progression, which is core to the experience. Absolutely every part of the game is influenced by new abilities being received throughout the story. What is going to make dissection of all these aspects more difficult is the amount of technical issues the game has, even after a hefty amount of patches. Let's say we start with combat, the most prominent gameplay part of Fallen Order. Sometimes when you move or dodge behind an enemy to attack, they turn around instantly so their block meter is depleted instead of health. And sometimes they don't, so their health gets lower as you'd expect. Is this differentiation caused by glitches or a design problem of very sensitive position detection? I can't tell. Sometimes parry gets activated when you press as early as an enemy starting their attack wind-up, and sometimes your main character Cal Kestis doesn't parry when you press the button in the middle of the wind-up animation, even though you would expect him to. And at first I thought that maybe this is because Cal also needs time to prepare his parry, except that sometimes it doesn't seem to matter and everything is successful. And sometimes when you don't parry, but actually keep blocking, Cal still parries at one point for some reason, which is of course beneficial to me as a player, but really unclear why that happens. These inconsistencies can be frustrating considering that Fallen Order goes for a pretty deliberate combat system. You can't interrupt any of your actions, so you have to think everything through. But here we get to what I have said about Fallen Order not knowing what it wants to be. These deliberate mechanics are conflicting with the enemy and encounter design. It is not uncommon for the game to send a large mix of close combat and ranged enemies your way. That is even a special double-bladed lightsaber upgrade specifically to help with crowd control. What makes this all even weirder is that the melee enemies have actually pretty fast animations, so without that double-bladed lightsaber you might feel some very unfair pressure. And I specifically mention unfair rather than difficult, because it is one thing to be a challenging game, but something else entirely to be fair while remaining challenging. Jedi Fallen Order is not that. For example, enemies have unblockable red attacks. Some of these attacks actively track you should you dodge before their wind-up ends, but others don't. This is particularly annoying with bosses that tend to have both types. And dodging only after a wind-up isn't a surefire solution because some attacks are very quick, so waiting for the wind-up to transform into an attack means to already be late. Some enemies have area of effect attacks that look small, but you're still going to get damaged after a simple dodge you have to roll. And some enemies have area of effect attacks larger than your roll distance, so you have to dodge and roll to get out of the area. Because of all this, combat in Fallen Order is a quite frustrating affair without force powers. Things become much more enjoyable once you can force push a rocket at the trooper that launched it, pull a Night Brother to yourself to one-hit kill them, and send a whole group of enemies standing near a pit to their doom. But even then, the game lacks consistency. Not only stylistical, active usage of force powers transforms Fallen Order into a much more fast-paced and less deliberate experience than its core combat systems, but also technical. Force pull is a great tool to interrupt some attacks, except sometimes it doesn't do that on the moves it worked before. At one point there is a boss battle with a giant bat, and let me be clear, it is an amazing boss battle, with the exception of the end, which is a pretty clunky set piece. But the fight itself is fantastic. The creature has a varied set of moves, several stages, there's clear wind-ups and behaviors, it switches between close ground based attacks to ranged flying attacks, you have to spend a bit of time figuring out what to do, it has everything a really well done boss battle needs to have. But then you encounter a situation where, due to how animations work, a force power dash that exists specifically to quickly close distance between you and the targeted enemy misses and doesn't fulfill its purpose when you have to damage the bat's wing before it's pulled back. So as a result, instead of using an upgrade to spend skill points on, you have to manually run up and hit. There are upgrades that I wish I wouldn't have bought because they actually mess things up rather than help. An example being the dodge kick ability. Some enemies are immune to it and instantly turn around, blocking you in the process and counter-attacking. So you have to actively remember to not press attack very quickly after dodging to not cause this defensive reaction. In general, the game's approach to trying to balance the lethality of the lightsaber doesn't quite work. There are two reasons for this. First, trying to balance the lightsaber makes some abilities quite useless. For example, the lightsaber throw power, which looks like it should fill the void of not having a ranged weapon, doesn't actively damage your enemies directly, but rather decreases their block meter. It makes this force power much less effective than your force pull, which actually lets you instantly kill those same enemies regardless of their block meter state. Then, after you deplete an enemy's block meter, they regain it after one hit, so you have to deplete the meter again. This makes some encounters feel rather drawn out, but one can't help but think that it would have been far better had the block meter on normal enemies been essentially the same as a health bar. All this doesn't mean that the combat of Jedi Fallen Order is bad. There are quite a lot of very enjoyable encounters, bosses especially. The lightsaber fights are fantastic, they're intense, well-paced, and test out all of your abilities. Enemy force users have a wide range of different combos, use force powers against you, have different aggression behavior depending on the state of the fight, Again, that is everything good boss battles need to have, but even they are not exempt from the inconsistencies we've discussed. Fallen Order's navigational aspects face a lot of similar technical and stylistic inconsistencies, like how sometimes side jumping while on a curved surface makes you stay parallel to that surface, and sometimes Kyle just jumps into the abyss instead, or how the ropes feel incredibly difficult to control as they seem to follow a bit more realistic physics, so actually swinging where you want to can be very annoying. Until, that is, you get the force pull power which will allow you to grab ropes from afar. Like with combat, jumping your way through levels is something that becomes quite more enjoyable as you gain more powers. In the beginning, your moveset is quite limited, and the game doesn't really create any particularly engaging situations with that. The game tries to use sliding down as a way to make some exciting acrobatic sections, but it is quite slow-paced, uneventful, and clunky to control. As a result, the sliding sections feel monotone. But even these sections become more enjoyable once they get obstacles that require the use of force powers. So as you fill your arsenal with wall running, double jumping, force pull, level environments also start shining with new colors. Navigating through the world of Fallen Order is most enjoyable during acrobatic sections, where you have to mix without interruption all these different force powers to progress. Which leads to another dichotomy. Such sections require more linear and controlled levels, and Fallen Order has plenty. But the game also wants to focus on exploration of intricate, interconnected environments. The way Fallen Order tries to handle this is the following. To complete the next objective, you have to go through a series of linear or semi-linear environments. Very rarely are the areas actually open, and exploration usually amounts to taking a look at several extruding level branches to find whatever is hidden there and then going back to the main path. Some of these explorative branches also allow you to open shortcuts to locations visited earlier. Some of the most open areas are in fact hubs that essentially hold entrances to different, more linear sections of the map that follow the principles we have outlined earlier. Some of these entrances are blocked until you get a particular tool or force power. On a planet like Zepho, which you'll have to revisit throughout the campaign, most of the time this mix is quite successful. There are some problems with the fact that not all of the linear sections are built with backtracking in mind. For example, the Venator Star Destroyer wreckage has several pathways you can choose, and one of them leads outside the whole area, and if you want to get back without going all the way around to enter the Venator wreckage from the beginning again, you have to abuse your force powers. By the way, this is where I found out that using force powers while in air resets your double jump, which is what has allowed me to ultimately avoid getting to the beginning of the section. But this Venator wreckage problem is nothing compared to Costiuc, half of which is designed as a long, linear level with no shortcuts between different sections and no backtracking possibilities. So if you have missed some of the level branches to explore, you have two choices. Either finish the whole level and then go through these sections all over again, or, well, try to die to reset to the latest meditation point you visited. Which, by the way, are another example of a mechanic that doesn't fit the game's design holistically. Meditation points are spread out across all planets. They act as a save point, but also if you decide to refill your health, all enemies on the planet will be respawned, which is different from the two specificities that games using these mechanics usually have. Enemy respawning being a price for saving your progress, and the areas you're exploring being deeply interconnected with tons of exploration to do. Now, on a surface level, it may look like the way Fallen Order does things is more player-friendly, but also it doesn't really matter. Here is the thing, we have discussed how most of the time you're going through planet sections in a linear order. Shortcuts are optional and rarely do you need to go back to an area after finishing it, so shortcuts are used mostly for when you revisit the planet later to explore some nooks and crannies you couldn't before. This means that it is always beneficial to regain your health at a meditation point. There is no real balancing of risk versus reward involved. More than that, if you don't regain your health, you might actually make things more difficult for yourself. There are plenty of narrative triggers in the game that change enemy composition on the map, filling cleared areas with them even if you didn't rest before. Once again, there is inconsistency in the approach to design. It doesn't help that exploration for the most part feels very meaningless. Sometimes by exploring you can find some new abilities for yourself or your droid, or increase the maximum amount of health refills you can carry, but most of the time you find some little lore points, ponchos, cosmetic lightsaber components, as well as skins for BD-1 or your ship. It's a shame because those explorative branches can be really nice with interesting challenges. Only the fact that you know that half of the time the best you can hope for is finding a poncho with 2 white lines instead of 1, or a different emitter component for your lightsaber, that doesn't really fill you with intrigue. It doesn't help that Fallen Order actively tracks how much of each planet you have explored. Again, on one hand it looks like this is supposed to help people with completionist tendencies. But on the other hand, the way this percentage of exploration fills up is very arbitrary. For example, on Zepho there is a shortcut rope which you can bring down in case you'll need it later, which most likely you won't, but the region won't be considered fully explored unless you climb that particular rope. Another exploration-related problem is the fact that tables which give new abilities look almost exactly the same as tables that just change the visuals of your lightsaber. If you're not aware of this fact at the beginning, it might be really easy to miss some of the upgrades should frequent lightsaber customization be not something you're interested in. Speaking of upgrades, I've mentioned at the beginning that progression is a very important wrapper of the entire experience, and considering how the game literally transforms as you get new abilities, you can see why. I can't help but feel that it was a mistake to focus on progression that much. First, there are 3 different ways to receive new abilities: mandatory story beats, optional upgrades, and by the way, some mandatory upgrades look like optional, so keep that in mind, and finally, the skill tree. The latter feels the most out of place. Most of the skills you can buy are focused on increasing your health, force power, or damage of your various abilities. It's not something that really helps the structure, especially considering that the parts of the skill tree that are available to you depend on the mandatory story bits anyway. And besides, this focus on progression plays a bit of an evil joke with Fallen Order, considering how inconsistent and problematic its core systems can be until upgrades and new abilities alleviate a lot of those problems. So get a situation where the sections before unlocking new abilities can feel quite frustrating and unfulfilling. Now, at the beginning of the video, I have mentioned how Jedi Fallen Order wears its inspirations on its sleeves. However, some of the most holistically consistent and best parts of the game are not inspired by neither Dark Souls, nor Uncharted, nor Metroid, but rather The Legend of Zelda. Throughout the game, you will explore several ancient tombs that are structured like Zelda dungeons. Close interconnected environments where different puzzles and enemies are recontextualized once you gain a new ability within said dungeons. Perhaps this is because these tombs are the only parts of the game where it feels like every aspect works together rather than being a set of not well-connected mechanics. Even meditation points within these dungeons actually require you to make a conscious choice whether to refill your health or not, as due to not being linear, you will have to revisit different chambers, so enemies respawning is actually something you should take into consideration. But this also makes these tombs feel stylistically inconsistent with the rest of the game. Ultimately, everything boils down to Jedi Fallen Order not knowing what path it wants to carve for itself. Lightsaber combat is slow and deliberate, but enemy design is fast-paced and actiony, and force powers help make the combat scenarios feel like that as well. There is a big focus on exploration, but levels are mostly linear and exploration of what's there doesn't feel rewarding. Fallen Order is inconsistent. Technical issues that you will encounter quite a lot, ranging from mechanics not working as intended to enemy AI getting literally broken, only make it feel even more inconsistent. Still, there's quite a lot of really good things in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order 2, so should we open up all the possible scores for design, I will assign a 6. Fallen Order can be disjointed and inconsistent, not to mention full of technical problems, but also can feel pretty fun. It never really becomes great at promoting exploration, but combat and acrobatics surely become more enjoyable as you progress. And for what it's worth, it is a solid foundation for a future sequel, so let's hope that Jedi Survivor is going to improve upon all the game's aspects and find its own direction that is not just about mixing up mechanics and principles from different games. Let's move on to context. This category has the weight of 1 as it's about things that enhance the experience rather than define it: plot, motivation, character arcs, etc. Jedi Fallen Order takes place 5 years after Episode 3 Revenge of the Sith. It tells the story of Cal Kestis, a young Jedi who has cut himself out from the Force after the traumatic events of Order 66 and hides from the Imperial Inquisition. Soon he meets another Jedi who also has cut ties from the Force, Cere, and her pilot companion Grease. Together they follow the clues left by Cere's former teacher to discover a hidden holocron that contains a list of all the Force-sensitive children throughout the galaxy. Completing this goal would allow the main cast to rebuild the Jedi Order, which of course we know won't actually happen due to the situation during Episode 4 A New Hope. This removes a big part of intrigue from the plot perspective. You already know that this goal is bound to fail or not be completed, if not in this particular game, then in the next. So in cases like this, what's important is not the what, but the how, which includes the arcs and struggles of the main character cast. Like the game's mechanics, the narrative of Fallen Order is something that really doesn't shine until later in the game. When you start, the only interesting character you're going to encounter is Prauf, who of course dies in the prologue trying to save us from the Imperial Inquisition. Meanwhile, Cal for the longest time feels like your typical bland, brooding protagonist, and neither Cere nor Grease provide a likable impression. The writing is very expository, focusing more on the central holocron mystery and lore rather than on the personal struggles of the main cast. As a result, the first half of the game feels pretty boring narrative-wise. You get what the goal is and follow the MacGuffin, but there is barely any understanding why we should actually care or create emotional connections with the cast. A large reason for that is the fact that we don't delve into the past of the main characters until pretty late into the story, and those are imperative for the game's emotional payoff. Because at the core of Fallen Order are the themes of guilt, self-blame, and the struggle to overcome that. Every prominent character has a failure defining their past, and the reaction to that failure is what affects their future. Cal feels like he has failed his former master, Cere has failed her former student. Other examples would get into real spoiler territory, but we don't have to go there in this video. We can discuss everything we need without spoilers. Trauma, self-imposed guilt, the darkness within that it can reveal, the feeling of betrayal, and the search for redemption. Jedi Fallen Order will explore all that and how different characters handle or fail to handle those emotions. In the late game. First half of the experience might fail to catch a player's interest, but the second includes some incredibly poignant and powerful moments about coping with failure and stopping self-blame. I also really appreciate, again without getting into spoilers, how the plot revolving around the holocron list of Force-sensitive children is resolved, and how that is tied with the arcs of the main characters. I have to admit, I expected a very standard and foreseeable resolution that would act as a sequel hook, but the game has subverted those expectations and actually provided an interesting conclusion. It is also tied to the fate of the ancient civilization, the ruins of which we'll explore throughout the story. As a side note, I understand why the new Star Wars continuity decided to make a new ancient civilization that wasn't present in the previous continuity as a sort of clean slate, but also considering the many similarities between the Zepho and Rakata, I'm not sure why the clean slate was needed. They perform many of the same functions anyway. Regardless, should we open up all the scores for context, I will assign a 7. It takes quite a while for the game's narrative and character arcs to get going, and that's a big problem. But once the wheels start actually rolling, the game creates a very compelling Star Wars story. Now let's discuss aesthetics. This is another category with a weight of 1, as it is about other aspects that enhance the experience rather than define it: visual style, music, sounds, etc. Star Wars has always had a very distinct aesthetic, both in the original trilogy as well as the prequels. Jedi Fallen Order does a great job of recreating the visual and sound design of that universe. I know this is gonna be a standard and honestly pretty rote phrase, but this game feels like Star Wars. There is some weirdness when it comes to music design. Star Wars is a musically rich franchise. When you watch a Star Wars movie, practically every step of the way is going to be accompanied by John Williams' amazing orchestrations. Now, I'm not saying Jedi Fallen Order has to follow the exact same stylistic, but here we get to some inconsistencies. There are plenty of moments when you don't hear any music in the background at all, and many that are full of ambient or action music. And it's not a matter of contrast between more exploratory and action moments, but sometimes there's just a lot of music and sometimes there's barely any without any seeming rhyme or reason to that. But then again, this could be part of technical issues of this game, which affect aesthetics as well for sure, sometimes even ruining what should be emotional scenes by having all sounds and voices become weirdly delayed in some cutscenes.
That's good, buddy.
The time's come. This may be the last you see of me. I can sense the doom of the Jedi Order is upon us. No! Failure is not the end. It is a necessary part of the path.
Also, one pretty minor but particularly disturbing aspect is the face of young Cal in flashbacks, which looks like the face of adult Cal was placed on a youngster's body. Feels pretty weird. But anyway, I don't actually have a lot more to say about this aspect, so let's open up all the scores for aesthetics, and I will assign an 8. The game has a particular Star Wars feel to it, and everything is mostly implemented in high quality, but a combination of some weird aesthetic choices and some technical issues make everything feel somewhat unpolished. Time to talk about Cohesion. This category has a weight of 2, and it's about how well the game connects all of its different aspects together to create a wholesome, holistic experience. This is probably one of the wonkier parts of Jedi Fallen Order. For example, meditation points that respawn enemies on the map. This is a game mechanic that has been used in more than one game, but in this particular case it doesn't really fit the universe or narrative. Why would enemies suddenly respawn? Not clear. The overall progression aspect of the game is justified by Cal cutting himself out from the Force due to traumatic events he lived through as a teenager, which properly explains why we start with no Force powers and regain more as we rebuild the connection with the Force. The clunkiness manifests in the manner in which some of the mandatory powers are regained. There are some, like Force Pull, which are regained as a power in particularly strong moments of need. Why these moments would lead to a training flashback which would result in Cal getting the power back makes perfect sense. Then there are powers that you regain in a sort of arbitrary way. Honestly, at times it feels like it just happens, like the wall run ability. You see the wall running lizards plenty of times throughout the area you're in, but then only one particular dead end leads to a flashback and regaining the power after seeing those wall running lizards. Without getting into spoilers, the lightsaber customization is limited in some aspects until a certain story point. And it makes perfect sense why it would be limited, but also it would make even more sense had it not been available at all until that moment, as customizing your lightsaber until that narrative beat sort of goes against the emotional and thematic impact it was supposed to create. Throughout the game you use your lightsaber to cut through pretty much all vegetation that's in your path, but in one particular location there's tree branches that don't look any different from what you would see in other places, but they're immune to your lightsaber and can only be burned down with fire. And all that is if we sort of suspend our disbelief regarding the balance of our lightsaber's lethality, which was already discussed in the design section. So you can probably see why when we open up all the scores for Cohesion, I will assign a 7. The game pretty often does good and sensible things that would lead to creating a more cohesive Star Wars experience, but a bunch of stuff also feels arbitrary. Time for our final category, emotions. This is the most subjective part of Stasocritic, as it is all about personal feelings, but it has the second biggest weight, 3, because personal feelings matter a whole lot and can balance out even very flawed experiences. I have heard a lot of good things about Jedi Fallen Order, so I expected to quite enjoy the game. But playing through the experience, I went through pretty much the whole possible array of emotions. It should be noted that this is how my first launch of the game looked like, and mind you, the footage you will see now has been absolutely unedited. I had to restart the whole console to be able to actually properly start the game, and I just encountered a lot of bugs, and that definitely has affected my emotional reaction. Some were a bit harmless but still annoying, like how there was a moment when Cal wouldn't pull his lightsaber torch motion down and I had to find out which action would get him out of that state. There was a very epic moment at the end of the game, which is a linear set piece. I'm not going to show footage of it to avoid spoilers, but even then the epicness of that linear section was ruined because I had to replay it a couple of times due to the game bugging out, once with invisible wall on the way and once with Cal refusing to jump from a particular platform. But even outside of the technical issue aspect, not everything is clean cut. I will be absolutely honest, the entire prologue section I was absolutely bored, and it lasted for 40 minutes. Bogano wasn't that much more interesting either. Then the game gives a choice between Zepho and Dathomir, which was my first choice in the early game, doesn't feel great at all. It literally took me 2.5 hours to get to a moment when I would only start enjoying the game, and the only reason I didn't drop it before is because of some friends who have said that I should go through the first Zepho visit before making a final decision. And I did start enjoying the game after that, but both the inconsistent design decisions and bugs would keep adding to the frustration. Let's just say my feelings about Fallen Order have remained pretty conflicting throughout. Every positive aspect would later be accompanied by some sort of negative feeling. All that said, even when taking the bugs I have mentioned before into account, the game did end on a very high and epic note, so I suppose it all worked out. But still, should you open up all the scores, everything I have said leads to me assigning a 7. In the end, I did end up enjoying Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order quite a bit, but it was a journey full of caveats. Let's summarize everything. After all scores and their weights are taken into account, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order gets a final Stasocritic rating of 64. It's a very flawed but ultimately a pretty nice game. It definitely deserves my recommendation as long as you know what to expect. And what you should expect is a game that has a lot of potential, interesting gameplay and narrative moments, but all that is mixed in with bugs, unfitting design aspects, and in general a feeling like this is a collection of mainstream mechanics more than anything. It does feel like Star Wars, sure, but lacks wholesomeness. An interesting discussion would pertain to the difference between my opinion and the overall critical response, which seems to be much more positive. To me there is one clear explanation, a matter of expectations. I've mentioned at the very beginning that we hadn't had a Star Wars game in this style for a whole total of 9 years. After such a long wait, a game that is actually not bad is going to get a lot of positive response, of course. And it's far from a bad comeback. As a game designer, I can fully understand the challenges of making a game like Jedi Fallen Order in the context that developers from Respawn had, and I can only hope that now that the first game is out of the door, the Jedi Survivor sequel is gonna be a huge improvement upon every aspect of the experience.